Hello everyone, welcome to our next lecture on the Introduction to Human Anatomy. So in this one, we're going to talk about the major body cavities, really two major body cavities, the dorsal body cavity and the ventral body cavity. So in general, body cavities are going to be spaces inside the body, like you can see in yellow here. And there are lots of small cavities in the body, but in this section, we're just going to talk about really the largest ones. That's why these are major body cavities. Okay? So there are really two major ones, the dorsal body cavity, which you can see in yellow in this image here and here, and then the ventral body cavity, which you can see in red in this image here. Okay? So the dorsal body cavity is going to be the posterior or dorsal cavity, like the name implies, inside the skull and vertebrae. So this dorsal body cavity is going to contain two cavities inside of it. Okay, so it's kind of, imagine it as a big box with two boxes inside of it. Okay, so the first cavity inside the dorsal body cavity is called the cranial cavity. That's going to be the space inside the skull, and that's going to be the cavity that contains the brain. Okay. The second space or cavity within that dorsal body cavity is called the vertebral cavity. This is going to be the space inside the vertebrae, or what you would kind of commonly call your spine, right? So the space inside these vertebrae. This is going to be the cavity that contains the spinal cord. So dorsal body cavity is actually really simple. Right? Now you can see it from lateral view here, and then also from the anterior view here. Right? Cranial cavity up here, vertebral cavity down here, and those two are part of the dorsal cavity. Okay? So next would be the ventral body cavity. The ventral body cavity is much bigger and much more complex than that dorsal body cavity. So this is going to be the large anterior or ventral body cavity. And it contains two major cavities, what's called the thoracic cavity and then what's called the abdominal pelvic cavity. Now these two large major spaces within the ventral cavity are separated by a dome-shaped muscle called the diaphragm. That's going to be basically right underneath your rib cage. So above that dome-shaped muscle is your thoracic cavity. Below that dome-shaped muscle is your abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay, so you'll see your thoracic cavity described as a large cavity inside the rib cage superior to the diaphragm. Okay? Now this cavity itself is going to contain a number of smaller cavities. This thoracic cavity is actually really busy. There's a lot going on inside of it. Okay? So the thoracic cavity contains the right and left pleural cavities. Those are going to be these lateral spaces that you see for the lungs here. So this one would be our patient's right pleural cavity, which would contain the right lung, and this would be our patient's left pleural cavity, which would contain the left lung. Okay, so these two pleural cavities are in that thoracic cavity. Now, there's going to be a space between the pleural cavities. That's called the mediastinum or mediastinum, right? However you want to pronounce it, as long as you can spell it. Right? So this is a mediastinum here in the middle, between those right and left pleural cavities. Now that mediastinum itself is going to contain a cavity inside of it. The cavity inside the mediastinum is the pericardial cavity, and that's going to be the cavity for the heart. Right? Hence the name pericardium. Right? So so kind of think about it like this. The thoracic cavity is one big box. That box has three boxes inside of it. The two pleural boxes and the mediastinum. The mediastinum itself has a box inside of that. So that's your pericardial cavity. Okay? So it's like a box. It's like three boxes inside a box, and then one of those, the middle box has another box inside of it. Okay? So next is the abdominal pelvic cavity below the diaphragm, inferior to the diaphragm here. Now the name to this one gives it away. You can break the abdominal pelvic cavity into two cavities: the superior large abdominal cavity and the inferior smaller pelvic cavity. So basically what separates these is kind of like an imaginary line here that you can sort of draw over the surface of the pelvis. So, that whatever's inside the pelvis is pelvic cavity, whatever's above the pelvis is abdominal cavity. So abdominal cavity is going to contain, a lot of organs, like kidney, liver, spleen, stomach, gallbladder, intestines, and a number of others. It also contains another cavity inside of it called the peritoneal cavity, which we'll talk about when we get to digestive system. And then the pelvic cavity inside the pelvis contains mostly urinary and reproductive organs, like the urinary bladder, and if you're female, the uterus, the ovaries, and other organs that we're not discussing here. So this is going to be a flowchart that shows you these cavities kind of in a different way. This is from a different textbook. So I like to kind of think about it this way. For those of you who are visual, this will help as well. So it shows you the ventral body cavity is separated by the diaphragm into the thoracic cavity and the abdominal pelvic cavity. And then it shows you, this thoracic cavity is a box that has 3 boxes inside of it, right? Your right pleural cavity, your left pleural cavity, and your mediastinum in the middle. And then that mediastinum has another box inside of it called the pericardial cavity. It also shows you some of the organs inside. Now, I mentioned most of these, right? The lungs and the pleural cavities, the heart and the pericardial cavity. But I kind of didn't mention the mediastinum because it wasn't in the previous image. But you'll see things like the trachea, the esophagus, major blood vessels in this mediastinum. So here's your abdominal pelvic cavity, right, which is another box containing that peritoneal cavity, like I mentioned, but also includes the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The abdominal cavity contains many organs and glands, and then the pelvic cavity contains urinary bladder, reproductive organs, and though I did mention it, like the last sections of the digestive tract, like the rectum. Okay? But this is just kind of another way to look at the same thing, and I know for some of you this might be helpful. All right, so let's answer a question here. Which of the following body cavities is inside the dorsal body cavity? Okay, so which of the body cavities that we learned about here is in the dorsal body cavity? So the correct answer to this one is D, right? The vertebral cavity. All the rest of these, right? Mediastinum is in the thoracic cavity. Pericardial cavity is in the mediastinum. Pelvic cavity is in the ventral body cavity, technically in the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? And that means all the rest of these are also in that ventral body cavity. The only one that's in the dorsal is the vertebral cavity.